The dawn broke slow over Dust Creek, a town carved out of stubborn earth and stubborn men, where the sun rose like a weary old sheriff who had seen too many fights and expected to see many more. The sky spread wide and pale, brushing the tops of the distant mesas with a faded gold that made the land look more haunted than holy. Dust Creek had always been a place where tempers simmered under the heat, where a man's shadow sometimes weighed heavier than his name, and where stories traveled faster than wagons on a downhill run. It was a frontier town built on grit, gun smoke, and the unspoken rule that anyone who did not belong had better ride on quick before curiosity turned to trouble. That morning, though, something shifted in the quiet air long before the first boots stepped onto the wooden boardwalks. Riders whispered of an Apache warrior crossing the ridges at dawn, moving with the steady confidence of a man who feared nothing the town could offer. His name was Chayton Black Hawk, known across the territories not for savagery as some settlers liked to claim, but for the calm strength he carried, the kind that made reckless men hesitate before drawing steel. Folks said he was the kind of warrior who rode alone not because he had no people, but because his presence was too heavy for most men to stand beside. He was a man shaped by the desert, quiet as the wind before a storm, steady as the bison that once ruled the plains. When he rode into town, the horses in the livery tensed, the saloon piano faltered mid-tune, and the townsfolk stiffened in a way that spoke louder than fear. They had not expected him. They had not prepared for him. But Dust Creek was not a place where surprise softened the edges of men. It sharpened them. At the center of town stood Jedediah Crane, a ranch boss whose voice carried more authority than the sheriff and whose property covered more land than a man could ride in a day. He had built Dust Creek with a kind of ruthless determination that left no room for hesitation. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by sun and resentment. The moment he heard that an Apache had entered his territory, he stepped out with a stance that said trouble was expected, welcomed, and already answered. Crane walked into the dusty street as Chayton dismounted, boots touching ground with the calm weight of someone who had faced rifles, fires, and heartbreaks without flinching. Chayton carried no fear. He carried only purpose. He came seeking supplies for his journey north, nothing more than a fair trade and safe passage through a town that owed him no kindness but also no hostility. Crane saw this and did not care. He saw an opportunity instead. Dust Creek had a secret, one whispered behind saloon doors or murmured with embarrassment at the general store counter. Crane had a daughter kept hidden from town eyes, a young woman named Eloise whom no one ever saw without a heavy veil. She was spoken about in hushed tones, claimed to be cursed, deformed, unlucky, or a mix of all three. Some said she had a face that could spook cattle. Others claimed she was marked by the devil himself. But the truth was far simpler. Crane needed her gone. Men had tried to court her, or rather, Crane had tried to push them toward her. But every time the veil lifted, the suitor fled in terror or disgust. And Crane's humiliation grew. So when Chayton walked into his town with the quiet authority of a man difficult to intimidate, Crane felt the ground shift beneath his boots. He saw a chance to rid himself of the burden he had carried for years. He stepped forward with a hard voice that carried across the street, telling Chayton that Dust Creek did not give favors to outsiders, especially to Apaches. If Chayton wanted safe passage, he would have to agree to terms. There would be no trade, no negotiation, only one price: marry Crane's daughter or leave the town without supplies. The words fell into the air like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. The ranch hands stiffened. The shopkeepers blinked in disbelief. The saloon girls leaned toward the doorway with widened eyes. No one had expected Crane to lay out such a demand. No one understood why he would force his daughter on an Apache warrior of all people. No one, except perhaps Crane himself, who trembled ever so slightly under the weight of the lie he had carried. Chayton did not react as others would have. He did not raise his voice, protest, or curse the man who stood before him. Instead, he studied Crane with the calm gaze of a hawk watching a rattlesnake coil. He sensed dishonesty, the kind that left a bitter taste long before a word was spoken. He felt that this ultimatum carried more weight than Crane wanted the town to see. But honor was a guiding star to Chayton, stronger than pride, stronger than the instinct to refuse a request that felt tainted. Marriage meant something deep to his people, something sacred, but so did promises. And if this man demanded such a vow, there had to be a reason buried beneath the dust. Crane pushed further, voice trembling with a mix of nerves and false authority. He told Chayton he must decide before sundown. No Apache could linger in his town without paying the price. Either he stayed and married Eloise, or he mounted up and left the valley without food, water, or passage rights. The sun climbed higher, burning across the wooden storefronts and turning the dirt road into a shimmering trail of heat. Chayton looked at the sky, then at the people who watched with narrowed eyes. He saw fear, but not fear of him. Fear of the truth Crane was hiding. And that truth tugged at him with a strange pull he could not explain. Something in this place was wrong. Something in Crane's trembling, in his forced bravado, spoke louder than the man intended. Chayton had lived his life following instincts honed by hardship, and those instincts spoke now as clearly as a drum in the night dot, so he nodded. Not as a defeated man, but as one accepting a path fate had shaped long before he rode into town. His voice remained calm as he agreed. He would marry the girl hidden behind the veil. He would stand beside her without knowing her face. And he would uncover whatever secret Crane had buried beneath this impossible demand. The townspeople gasped. Crane exhaled in visible relief. Chayton stood unmoved as the sun dipped lower, knowing that sometimes a man must walk into the unknown to uncover the truth waiting behind. Silence. The wedding would take place at dawn, and Dust Creek would never be the same again. The morning of the wedding rose slow and pale, the kind of dawn that seemed to hesitate before touching the earth, as if unsure whether Dust Creek deserved its light. A thin veil of desert fog drifted low along the ground before the heat could lift it, and the sound of horses nickering in distant corrals carried across the valley like restless whispers. Dust Creek rarely saw ceremonies of joy, and it saw even fewer marriages that felt anything close to natural. This one felt even stranger, as though the land itself held its breath, waiting to witness something it could not predict. Chay-ton Black Hawk awoke long before sunrise. Sitting silently beside the small fire he'd built behind the livery stable where he had spent the night. The flames flickered in steady rhythms that matched the calm rise and fall of his breath. He sat cross-legged, eyes half closed, listening to the heartbeat of the land the way his elders had taught him when he was young. He felt no fear. He felt no regret. What he felt most was a sense of purpose forming around him like the quiet of the desert before a turning storm. He had accepted the marriage because something in Crane's eyes had spoken louder than his ultimatum. And now he intended to see it through, inside the town. The small church stood stiff against the morning breeze. It was little more than a wooden chapel with a slanted roof, a single bell, and windows that looked out onto open land. But to the settlers it carried weight, the kind born from a belief that walls and a cross could hold civilization together. Today it would hold something else: curiosity, suspicion, and the uncheckable hunger for truth. Inside the church sat Eloise Crane, veiled from head to toe in a long white covering that brushed the wooden floorboards. Her hands rested trembling in her lap, fingers clutching the fabric as though it were the only thing tethering her to the earth. She had lived most of her life hidden from Dust Creek, hidden even from her own reflection at times, because her father insisted the world was not ready to see her. She had grown up behind curtains, behind closed doors, behind rumors that painted her as cursed, deformed, or possessed. She was none of those things, yet she felt the weight of them all pressing on her chest. Her father paced behind her, boots echoing through the empty church with nervous tension he tried to hide. When he glanced at his daughter, his eyes held guilt he had never confessed, but it lingered between them like the dust that never settled in this town. Eloise wanted to ask him one final time if this was right, if binding her life to a man she had never met was the answer, but she already knew what he would say. Jedediah Crane never backed down. Not from storms. Not from enemies. And not from the lies he built to protect his pride. Outside, townspeople gathered along the wooden fence lines and porch railings as though watching the arrival of a prisoner, not a groom. Their eyes followed Chayton as he approached the church with unhurried steps, his posture straight and steady under the weight of the moment. Some whispered that he was cursed for agreeing to the marriage. Some whispered that the daughter behind that veil would doom him. Others simply watched with a hunger for spectacle. Dust Creek loved fear more than it loved truth. Chayton entered the church quietly. The murmurs outside fell still as he stepped into the dim interior where lanterns flickered along the walls. The preacher, an old man with trembling hands, stood at the altar looking like he would prefer wrestling a rattlesnake to officiating this union. His voice barely carried when he greeted Chayton and gestured to the front pew. Eloise did not lift her head when she heard him arrive. Chayton walked down the aisle with steps that carried no hesitation. When he reached the altar, he bowed his head respectfully, then turned toward the veiled woman he was about to marry. She seemed fragile in her stillness, like a bird ready to bolt if touched too suddenly. Chayton sensed the tremor of fear wrapped inside her silence. But he also sensed something deeper, strength, a strength she did not yet know she possessed. The ceremony began with the preacher speaking slowly, his voice wavering between the words. He mentioned union, duty, vows, and the blessing of God upon those who honored the commitments placed before them. Chayton listened quietly. Eloise breathed in shallow, careful pulls. Crane watched with the tense posture of a man waiting for a secret to explode. Then came the moment the entire town had been whispering about for years. The unveiling. The revealing of the cursed face. The moment every rumor had built toward like a storm building behind distant mountains. The preacher hesitated. Crane stiffened. Eloise braced. And Chayton stepped forward with hands that moved slow and intentional. He touched the edge of the veil the same way he would touch the fragile wing of an injured bird. The fabric trembled. Eloise's breath faltered, and the entire church leaned forward as though 1,000 held breaths were pressing toward the altar. The veil lifted. Silence fell. Not the silence of shock alone, but the silence of truth spreading through minds that had clung to lies for too long. Eloise was not ugly. She was not cursed. Her face was untouched by deformity. She had soft features that held gentleness in every line. Her eyes were deep, quiet, filled with fear but also with a hidden resilience. She was a woman who had lived beneath the weight of rumors she never earned, shaped by a father who feared the cruelty of the town more than he trusted its fairness. Chayton did not recoil. He did not blink. His expression remained steady, but inside him something shifted. A fierce, protective calm rose like a tide, not because he pitied her, but because he recognized the truth behind her eyes. She was like him. Someone who did not fit the mold this land demanded. Someone judged before being known. Someone who had survived isolation born from fear, not from truth. The church began to murmur. Women glanced at one another with confusion. Men frowned, unsure whether they should feel relieved or deceived. Crane looked ready to collapse under the pressure of years of lies cracking open. Chayton spoke first, his voice low but carrying across the wooden pews. He asked Eloise gently why she had been hidden, Why her father had branded her with a lie so heavy she carried it like a burdened animal in a land of unforgiving men. Eloise swallowed hard and told the truth with the quiet courage of someone stepping into sunlight for the first time. She said her father hid her because her mother had been Apache, because Jedediah Crane feared the town would reject her, because he believed the world would treat her cruelly if it learned her blood was half from the people Dust Creek. Distrusted. The church shifted like a living thing struck by lightning. Chayton's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger at Eloise, but at the cruelty that had shaped her life. Her beauty was not her curse. Her heritage was not her shame. Her father's fear had built the prison she lived in. The preacher continued the ceremony, shaky but determined to see it through. And when Chayton and Eloise spoke their vows, something in the air changed. As though Dust Creek itself felt the truth rising at last. They were married. Not by choice of love yet, but by fate, and by a truth stronger than any veil. The wedding ended just as the sun reached its highest peak, spilling harsh light through the church windows and casting long shadows across the wooden pews. Dust Creek buzzed with whispers, each word pushed along by curiosity that moved faster than the afternoon wind. The townsfolk had expected something monstrous behind the veil. They had been ready to recoil, ready to strengthen the rumors they had clung to for years. Instead, they found themselves wrestling with something far more unsettling than ugliness. They found themselves wrestling with the truth. Eloise Crane was beautiful, gentle, and half Apache. And that truth cut deeper into Dust Creek than any knife could. Outside the church, Chayton stood beside his new wife with the quiet composure of a man who had weathered storms far worse than gossip. Eloise kept her hands clasped together, unsure whether to look at him or keep her eyes downcast. The veil hung loosely over her arm now, no longer a shield but a reminder of what she had lived behind. The townspeople watched them with a mix of confusion, suspicion, and reluctant fascination. As though the two newlyweds carried a secret they were desperate to understand but too afraid to touch, Jedediah Crane approached them, stiff and uneasy, his jaw tight. No longer able to hide behind lies, he looked like a man stripped of armor. He told Chayton that the marriage was done, that the woman was now his responsibility, and that they were to leave Crane's land by sundown. His voice trembled almost imperceptibly, but Chayton noticed. Eloise noticed. The man could not hide the truth any longer. He was not trying to protect her. He had been trying to protect himself. From shame? From fear? From judgment? Chayton looked at the man without a hint of anger. Quietly he informed Crane they would leave, but not as fugitives. He would take her with honor. He would not let Crane talk as though she were something to discard. Crane faltered, unable to answer, and turned away as though running from the consequences of his own choices. Chayton led Eloise to the outskirts of town where his horse waited, and where the vast desert stretched endlessly toward distant ridges. The air felt cooler there, away from the staring eyes and whispered judgments. The wind brushed against Eloise's hair, lifting loose strands and tugging gently at the dress she wore. She felt exposed not because of her uncovered face, but because she stood beside a man she had just married without knowing his heart or his intentions. Chayton broke the silence first, speaking with the calm certainty she had already come to associate with him. He told her she would not be forced to come with him if she wished to stay. The marriage might be legal, but her life remained her own. She could decide her future now that the truth was out. Eloise looked at him with surprise. She had expected coldness or indifference. She had expected him to see her as a burden. Instead, she found compassion in his voice, an understanding she had never received from her own father. She whispered that she wanted to leave Dust Creek, not because she felt compelled, but because she could not remain where lies had shaped every year of her life. So they mounted his horse. Eloise sitting behind him with hesitant hands resting lightly at his waist. Chayton told her to hold on as the horse started forward with a steady gait. She obeyed, her fingers tightening around him as they rode into the open land where sky and earth met like two old friends. The wind swept her hair back and brought the smell of sage and dust, and for the first time she felt free. They rode until the town shrank behind them. When the sun dipped low, they stopped near a cluster of boulders that offered shelter from the wind. Chayton built a small fire with practiced ease. Eloise watched him, fascinated by the quiet strength in each movement. He offered her food and sat a respectful distance away, giving her space, giving her a sense of safety she had not expected from a stranger. After a long silence, she asked him the question that had pressed against her heart since the veil had lifted. She wanted to know if seeing her face had disappointed him. Chayton lifted his gaze to her with the same quiet intensity she had seen in the church. He told her the truth, that her face was not the shock. The real shock was the cruelty of forcing her to believe she was something to be hidden. Eloise listened in silence, and for the first time in her life she felt the weight of her past shifting. She asked him softly what he thought of her. He answered with honesty, not with romance or praise, but with truth. He thought she was brave for surviving a childhood shaped by lies. He thought she carried her mother's strength. He thought she deserved better than the cage she had been forced into. She swallowed hard at the mention of her mother. She had grown up knowing only fragments, pieces of a story her father never fully shared. She knew her mother had been Apache, gentle and strong, and that she had died before Eloise could remember her. But she had never known why her father despised that truth so much. Chayton leaned closer to the fire and told her the story her father refused to admit. He knew of her mother. She had belonged to a peaceful band that sought understanding between settlers and Apache families. She was kind and patient, and her heart had been open to a future where both peoples could live without hatred. But Dust Creek at that time had been more hostile than it was now. Settlers feared anything they did not understand. Crane had loved her but feared the judgment of other men. So he buried her memory instead of honoring it. He hid Eloise not because she bore shame, but because he did. Eloise listened with widening eyes, as though hearing her mother's spirit calling across years of silence. She felt tears burning against her lashes, not from pain but from the release that came with knowing the truth. She whispered that all she had ever wanted was to know where she came from, who her mother had been, and why her father could never speak her name without flinching. Chayton moved closer with careful steps, as though approaching a wild foal that needed gentleness more than anything. He placed a hand over hers, his touch warm but gentle. He told her she would learn everything, not from Dust Creek but from the land her mother belonged to. He would take her to the places her mother once walked. He would show her the stories the desert still held. Eloise looked into his eyes then, truly looked. She saw no pity. She saw strength, truth, and a quiet fire that flickered beneath his steady exterior. Her chest tightened with a feeling she could not name yet, but it warmed her from the inside like the glow of the fire at their feet. The night deepened around them, stars scattering across the sky in silver rivers. Eloise lay down on the blanket Chayton had prepared, the fire crackling softly nearby. Chayton sat awake for a long while, watching the horizon, guarding the silence, protecting the woman fate had placed beside him, and though neither spoke it aloud, something had changed in that quiet night under the open sky. Something tender, something dangerous, something like the beginning of love. The night after the feast settled into a stillness that only the frontier could hold. The wind sweeping from the distant mesas carried the whisper of dry earth and the scent of wood smoke as it curled around the Apache camp. Fires burned low and the stars shone like cold silver scattered across the eternal sky. Outside Red Hawk's lodge the world seemed quiet, yet inside him a storm brewed with a force he had never known. His hands trembled slightly as he replayed the moments of the feast. In his mind, especially the second unveiling when the scars were revealed and Adelaide stood pale but defiant, waiting for a judgment she had expected her whole life. She had looked at him with a steadiness that did not belong to someone broken. There had been sorrow in her eyes, yes, but there had also been the fiery hint of a woman who had survived every cruel hand dealt to her. Red Hawk felt that fire still burning in his chest as he paced the length of his lodge, hearing the words his chief had spoken earlier echo through him as if carved into stone. Beauty shifts like sand, yet courage remains. You saw only one side of her. The world saw another. Decide which one you believe. Red Hawk had always been a warrior who acted with certainty, yet tonight he could not find the surety he relied on. He had grown up with a sense of honor shaped by battle and tradition. When a man gave his word, it stood firmer than any stone. But he had also believed in choosing his own path and choosing a partner not forced upon him, not tricked into a binding promise by a cunning traitor who valued cattle and alliances more than his own daughter's dignity. The veil had been a lie. He had been misled. He had every right to walk away. The elders would permit it if he explained the deception. No shame, no dishonor. The path was open to leave the girl behind and return to the freedom he cherished. But as he remembered her trembling hands and the brave lift of her chin that night, he realized something within him resisted the idea of leaving her. That alone troubled him more than any lie behind the marriage bargain. He stepped outside, needing the night air to clear the tangled thoughts in his mind. The sky stretched above in a dark, endless dome, and the moon cast a pale glow over the land. He saw Adelaide sitting alone near the edge of the camp, wrapped in a simple wool shawl. She stared at the ground rather than the sky, shoulders curled inward, as though she expected ridicule or rejection at any moment. Red Hawk watched her silently for a long time before approaching. His footsteps made no sound on the dust. When he sat beside her, she stiffened as if preparing herself for bad news. "You should not sit alone where the night is cold," he said gently. "I am used to the cold," she answered without looking up. "It is kinder than people have been to me." Her voice held no bitterness, only truth spoken with the kind of quiet strength that wounded him more deeply than an arrow ever had. Red Hawk studied her face, the way the moonlight softened the scars, the way her hands curled nervously into her lap, the way her breath hitched every time she feared hearing the words she believed would fall from his lips. She assumed he would reject her. She was certain of it. Life had taught her to expect nothing else. "Your father hid your face from me," he said. "It was not your doing. I am not angry with you." At that she looked up and her eyes glimmered with surprise. Most men would have walked away already. He tilted his head, considering that maybe most men do not look closely enough. Her brows furrowed slightly as if she did not understand how she could be seen in any way other than broken. She lowered her gaze and whispered the words she had carried her whole life, like heavy stones tied to her soul. "Red Hawk, you do not have to keep your promise. You owe me nothing. I know why men look away. I know how I appear. My father has spent years trying to marry me off to anyone who would bring him profit or peace. He thought an Apache warrior would not question what hid behind the veil." Her voice cracked just enough to betray a pain she rarely allowed to surface. Red Hawk felt it like a wound in his own chest. "You speak of yourself as though you have no worth," he said. "Why? Because the world decided it long ago." For the first time he reached for her hand. She flinched as though expecting laughter or pity. Instead, he enclosed her hand in his gently, carefully. "Let me decide for myself what I see," he told her. She froze. Her breath caught. Her eyes lifted to his with a hope so fragile he feared it might shatter between them. Red Hawk continued speaking, but softly like a man revealing truths he rarely put into words. You think scars make you unworthy. In my people's ways, scars show survival. They show a spirit that does not fall. She swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken of her scars like that. My father told me a woman should be perfect, she murmured. Red Hawk shook his head. Your father is a man who fears the world. He wraps his fear in talk of beauty because that is easier than admitting he is weak. A startled laugh escaped her, though it trembled as if unsure whether it was allowed. Red Hawk studied her face again. The scars did not repulse him. They drew him in not because they marked pain, but because they marked endurance. The rest of her features, soft eyes, strong cheekbones, a delicate mouth, spoke of a beauty deeper than the world ever cared to see. But he did not want to make a decision based on a moment of emotion or compassion. He owed himself clarity, and he owed her honesty. I will not decide tonight, he told her. Marriage should never be chosen in anger or confusion. I will think on this. On you. On the truth I saw when the veil was lifted. And if you choose to leave, she whispered, then I will tell you to your face with respect. I will not vanish like a coward. She nodded, though sadness tightened her throat. She expected rejection. Yet she also seemed relieved that he would not treat her as others had. He rose to leave, but she stopped him with a quiet plea. Red Hawk, thank you for seeing me even for a moment. He touched her shoulder lightly. I saw more than you think. He walked back toward his lodge, feeling the weight of the choice ahead of him pressing heavily upon his spirit. The night felt colder, the silence deeper. Yet within that silence a truth stirred like a flicker of dawn. When he had first come to the ranch, he had not planned for any of this. He had not planned to feel anything for a woman not chosen by his own hand. But life on the frontier rarely followed the lines a man drew for himself. He lay down to rest, but sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adelaide, not broken, but brave, sitting alone in the moonlight, carrying pain with a dignity that humbled him. He knew then that the decision he made would shape more than his own life. It would shape hers. And that truth carried more weight than any battle he had ever fought. The dawn would bring clarity. Or so he hoped. Tomorrow he would choose. The dawn rose slowly over the wide plains, painting the sky in soft streaks of rose and gold as the first warmth of morning touched the Apache camp. The fires had burned down to faint beds of glowing red embers, and most of the warriors still slept wrapped in blankets and silence. Yet Red Hawk had been awake long before the first light touched the world. He sat outside his lodge, watching the horizon with heavy thoughts sitting like a stone upon his chest. A man could face down enemies without fear, but the weight of another person's heart was a different kind of challenge. Today, he had to choose. He thought of Adelaide as he watched the sun climb. The night before had revealed more to him than her scars. He had glimpsed the loneliness she hid behind quiet courage, the sorrow she carried from a lifetime of being judged by others, the small spark of hope she tried to smother for fear of it being exposed. He had also felt a shift inside himself, one that unsettled him more than he wished to admit. A warrior did not fear change, but he respected it. As he walked through the waking camp, he felt the curious gazes of other warriors, though none spoke. They knew the situation. They had seen the unveiling. They understood the weight of a union between clans and the honor at stake. Yet they also waited to see whether Red Hawk would follow his bonds or follow his heart. Adelaide sat near the creek that ran behind the camp, gathering water in a wooden bowl. The early sun lit her hair with a soft glow, turning the loose strands to threads of gold. Her scars caught the light as well, but instead of harshness, they carried a quiet dignity. She looked up as Red Hawk approached, and he saw fear flash in her eyes before she masked it behind a calm expression. She expected today to be the end. He stopped before her and spoke gently. "Walk with me." She hesitated but rose quietly. They followed the narrow path along the creek until the sound of water muffled the noise of the camp behind them. Red Hawk stopped under the shade of a cottonwood tree. Adelaide stood stiffly as if bracing herself for a blow. She had endured too many times in her life. "You said you would decide today," she whispered. "I know what the answer must be." He shook his head slowly. "You speak as though you can see my thoughts." "I have lived too long being unwanted," she murmured. "I know the look of hesitation. I know when someone regrets choosing me." Her words were soft, but they cut through him sharper than a blade. Red Hawk stepped closer, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You think I hesitate because of how you look," he said. "Is that not the truth?" "No," he answered firmly. "I hesitate because I want to choose you for the right reasons. Not out of duty. Not out of pressure. Not because your father tricked me. I wanted to be certain that my decision was made with honor." Adelaide blinked and a tear slipped down her cheek, though she quickly brushed it away as though ashamed of it. "And what did honor tell you?" He took her hand gently in his. "That I would be a fool to walk away." Her breath caught. She stared at him, not understanding, not believing. He continued speaking in a calm voice filled with a certainty he had not felt the night before. "I saw you when the veil was lifted, not just the scars. I saw the strength that held your head high even when you feared judgment. I saw the woman who survived things many would not. I saw a heart that has been wounded but still beats with courage. That is worth more than any false beauty." Her lips trembled. "Red Hawk, do not choose me because you pity me." He shook his head. "I choose you because something in me moved when I looked at you. Something real. Something that does not fade. I choose you because you stood before me not hiding even when afraid. I choose you because last night when I tried to sleep, I could not shake the thought of you alone beneath the moon, believing yourself unworthy. And that thought hurt me more than I expected." Adelaide lowered her head, and for the first time she allowed herself to cry without trying to stop the tears. Red Hawk placed a hand gently beneath her chin, lifting her face. "You are no burden," he said softly. "You are not a mistake. If you will have me, I choose to keep the promise I made. Not because I must, but because I want to." Her voice came out in a thin whisper. "I want to. I want to stay by your side. I want to be chosen for once in my life." He stepped forward and pulled her gently into his arms. She stiffened at first, not used to a man holding her without cruelty or indifference. But slowly her hands rose to his chest and she leaned into him, letting herself breathe in the safety she had never known. World around them quieted as if the land itself paused to witness the beginning of something unexpected and precious. Red Hawk rested his forehead against hers. "Then from this moment you are my wife." She nodded and he kissed her gently, a tender touch filled with promise. Though hesitant at first, she returned the kiss with a warmth that surprised them both. When they returned to the camp hand in hand, every warrior who saw them understood the decision. A few nodded in approval. Others simply looked on with respect. The union between them was no longer a forced bargain. It was a choice made by two hearts that had found each other in a world that rarely offered kindness. As the days passed, Adelaide grew more comfortable among the Apache. The women taught her their crafts and she learned to ride without fear. She worked with the tribe, tending to children, gathering herbs, preparing meals. Red Hawk guided her with patience, never rushing her and never allowing her to feel less than any other woman. At night, they sat by the fire sharing stories. She told him of her childhood, of the pain she carried and the dreams she had never dared to voice. He told her of battles fought and lost, of brothers buried, of the weight of leadership. Slowly trust grew between them like a seed placed deep in good soil, finally given light. One evening as the sun set behind the red cliffs, Red Hawk wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. She leaned into him with an ease she had never known. "You are not the woman I was tricked into marrying," he murmured. Adelaide stiffened slightly. No, you are the woman I chose, he said. And I would choose you again every sunrise. A soft smile spread across her face, warm and full and alive. She turned in his arms, resting her hands upon his chest. And I choose you, Red Hawk, every day, every night, without fear. The wind carried their words into the settling dusk, and the plains held them gently. Two souls scarred in different ways had found something rare in each other, something that grew far beyond the expectations of a bargain struck by her father or the padre or the kea. Shock of a veil lifted. They had found love that did not fade in the face of scars, love that did not falter in the face of fear, love that rose like dawn over the wide untamed West. And together they walked forward into a future no longer built on lies but on choice, on courage, on a bond strong enough to outlast the frontier itself.